My son, keep my words and treasure up my commandments with you. Keep my commandments and live. Keep my teaching as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call insight your intimate friend, to keep you from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with their smooth words. So, today we're looking at Proverbs chapter 6, 1 through 5. And we're talking about that we need to go back to the Word again. Here we see Solomon going back to God's Word again, saying, hey, treasure and keep God's commandments, because by them we live. This is what we need to remember. We need to go back to the Word again, always going back, always going back, always going back. That's what Solomon says to his son every time when he's introducing a new topic or reintroducing the same topic. He goes back to listen to these words, keep them, treasure them, don't forget them. These are important things that you need to know, and you cannot leave these behind. If you leave these behind, you will die. And so he says, by these things you will live. We take refuge in God and his word. Psalm 7, 1 through 2 says, O Lord my God, in you do I take refuge. Save me from all my pursuers, and deliver me, lest like a lion they tear my soul apart, rendering it in pieces with none to deliver. See, the Lord our God is our refuge, and it is in him that we find safety. Otherwise, our enemies would tear us apart. We would have nothing to stand on. It is only on God's word that we can stand. So we need to treasure up the commandments with us. We need to keep his commandments and live. They need to be a teaching. They need to be, as it says here, God's commands are to the apple of our eye, or the most precious thing to us. That's what it means to have something as the apple of your eye. Like Psalm 17:8 says, keep me as the apple of your eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings. And so we see here the idea that Solomon, and then in Psalm 17:8, you have the idea here that these teachings ought to be the apple of our eye. They should be the most precious thing to us. The question is that the case? Are these things really the most precious things to us? That's a good question to ask. I mean, is looking at Proverbs, has that been the most precious thing to you? What God's commanding here, is that the most precious, or is it something else? Is it something beyond that? Or what are we making an idol? Are these really the apple of our eye? That's a great question. It's a question we have to ask ourselves. And so we look at, see, this is the second thing he says. Keep them, right? Treasure up the commandments, and then make sure that they're the apple of your eye. Make sure they're the most precious thing. And then he goes about saying, what do you need to do? You need to bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablet of your heart. And so that's the next thing he says. God's commands should be bound to our fingers. What does that mean? Deuteronomy 6:8, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be a frontlets between your eyes. You take the commands of God and bind them to your fingers, so that whenever you're doing the work of, the idea is if you had them on your hand, right? While you're doing the work, while you're working, you would see them. They would be, this would be the idea, that it would be, so that God's words would be all over the things you would do with your hands. It'd be always present in the things that you're doing. That's the idea. Again, same idea of making them most precious, that they are the apple of your eye, that they're bound to your hands now. So everything you do, whenever you're working with your hands, that hand that you're seeing here, if you wrote it on the back of your hand, you would always see it when you're working. And everyone would see God's word in the things that you're doing. So you get the picture. It's a visual picture, not that you literally have to do that. But the idea is that whatever you're doing, God has God's commands all over it. And then he says that God's commands should be written on our hearts. Remember, our heart is what makes you, you. So whatever is about me as a person, that's my heart. And so Jeremiah 17:1 says, the sin of Judah is written with a pen of iron, with a point of diamond. It is engraved on the tablet of their heart and on the horns of their altars. He's saying for the people of Judah at this time, their sin is engraved on the tablet of their heart with a point of diamond. So The sharpest thing you can use, the hardest thing you can use, it's engraved in there. It's deep. It's, this is to show this, just the overwhelming strength and depth of their sin that has been on it. It's been written with a pen of iron, with a point of diamond. This is kind of the hardest thing you can engrave stone with. And so your stone heart's been engraved with sin. He's got sin written all over it. And on the horns of their altars, he says. So where they're going to go worship God, they've written sin. Their sins are engraved on the horn of the altar. The points of the altar on the corners. Have you ever seen pictures of the altar burnt, the burnt offering, when you put the altar, the altar where you would go to do that, had the little horns on the ends. And so he's saying that where you do your sin offering, actually you got sins written all over it. That's who you're offering to the sin. And so that's how bad these people are. So this is really the opposite of what you should see from the people that follow God. God's commands should be written on their hearts. We should have God's commands, God's law, engraved on our hearts. And Hebrews 8:10 says, "For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." And so that's where you have, as Christians, that's what we have. God has made that covenant with us. And he says, I will put my laws into their minds. We have God's law in our mind and God's law written on our hearts. And God is our God. And we are his people, the sheep of his pasture, right? And that's the idea, that we have been made his people. Pretty amazing, isn't it? And so that's the switch, right? And so that's the idea, though. If we're God's people, those laws should be written on our hearts. And so we come to the next idea, is that we should make God's commands our closest friend. That's what we see here. It says, say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call insight your intimate friend. You're my sister. You're my relative. You're my intimate friend. That's how close God's commands should be to us. The most precious thing, they should be written on our hearts. They are our most closest friend. They are our sister. And that's how we should think of God's word and his commands and his teachings. And that's how close they ought to be to us. And what does it say here? To keep you, if you do that, do all that to keep you, make sure you're doing this. Make sure they're the closest friend. Make sure they're written on your heart. Make sure they're apple of your eye. Make sure that you calling wisdom your sister and insight your intimate friend. There's a purpose for that. And then he says to keep you from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words. So keeping God's commands, keeping his insight, keeping his wisdom, keeping all that close to us, writing it in our hearts, doing all that, making sure we're following what it says. That will keep us from sin. We won't want to do the sin. We won't be trapped by sin. We won't be deceived into sin. We won't do it because we're ignorant of sin. We will not do those things if we have God's word written on our heart. If we're treasuring up, if we're doing all the things that Solomon says here, then it will keep us from doing sin, which is exactly what we want. We don't want to do sin. And so that will keep us from doing that. So that's the end of our study this week in Proverbs chapter 7, 1 through, we made through 5. And next time we'll get through some more of it. The main bulk of this, where we talk about what he's saying, that God's law, God's word, God's law will keep you from doing, which is to falling into adultery is the main sin he's talking about here. So come back next time and we will take a look at that.